So, welcome to this webinar on hosting a Waterway Recovery Group canal camp. As normally, if I was doing this presentation in person, I'd be prancing around in front of you, pulling sort of silly faces, etc. It's just what I tend to do. So as I can't do it in person, here's a picture. Many of you will have seen this before. I use it quite regularly in my presentations. My name's George Rogers. I am a work director, and basically I'm one of the work. That means I'm one of the work board. The work board is a group of people that are basically selected by the Inland Waterways Association trustees to run WERG, WERG being part of the IWA. And within that, I also am part of the WERG sites group. Many of you will have come across Mick Bradley, who used to be our technical support officer. And Mick retired back in March or April time, and we obviously realised that left us quite a hole that we needed to fill in terms of the sort of support to local societies and also the support to our leaders for the WERG canal camps. So in response to that, WERG decided to reform the WERG sites group. Reform, it's definitely the right phrase, but it probably hasn't been in existence for about the last 20 years. So it's had a reasonably fallow period. But it's been reformed now. There are about 7 or 8 of us, basically, some of the work directors, some of the other work volunteers, and basically we've taken on a lot of that responsibility from Mick's role to support local societies and to support our canal camp leaders. And within that, I have particular responsibility for future sites, basically all those sites that might be interested in a canal camp, might be interested in other things, but aren't yet currently on the schedule, which is really because I'm always quite busy and not always the most prompt at answering emails. So I do future sites rather than all of those that we're definitely committed to. So this webinar, as I said, we're going to look at what's involved in hosting a canal camp. So briefly, the agenda for tonight: what is a canal camp? Who does what, particularly between the local society and the WERG, and then a little bit about what else can WERG and IWA offer. There's a sort of core process for the actual canal camps, but WERG and IWA can offer quite a lot of support around that, and also has some different activities that we can offer. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then just run through sort of quite briefly what the process is for actually applying for canal camps. And then at the end, there'll be questions and hopefully answers. As I said just before we started, if you do have questions that you want to answer, do drop them in the Q&A box, preferably in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. Because if they're in the Q&A box, I'll definitely see them. And if I see them as they come through and there's a spot to answer them, I will do it then. Otherwise, I'll pick them up at the end. So let's start with what is a canal camp. Well, let's start with the 2 words canal camp. So canal, well, we don't specifically just deal in canals. We basically deal with any sort of navigable waterway or unnavigable waterway. But we're not restricted in that regard. It's not specifically canals to be restored. We do work on canals that have been restored and other waterways that have been restored. Obviously, our main focus is on things that do require restoration, but we do occasionally do jobs on navigable waterways as well. And then the word camp. To dispel the very first myth that we'll probably dispel tonight, camping does not mean we use tents generally, though just occasionally we do. Generally, we would be in a village hall, etc., and we'll get to that a little bit later on. The core canal camp product, not a phrase I particularly like, but a canal camp product is really our week-long working holidays. So generally, a week-long camp runs Saturday to Saturday, 6 working days from Sunday to Friday, and it's generally for volunteers that are aged 18 and over. And we do get a range within that. We get sort of younger volunteers that are often doing their Duke of Edinburgh award, so in that sort of 18 to 25 bracket. and then we get quite a substantial number that are sort of 45 and over. We do have a little bit of a gap generally between 25 and 45, which is sort of predominantly, that's when people are obviously going off and having families, etc. So that's the sort of core product. There are other things that we do as well, but I'll come to those later on. Within that, what sort of work do we do? Well, at this point, it's probably better that I show you some photographs. And I'm going to start off with some of the camps that are happening this summer or have happened this summer. And if you're an astute follower of the various Facebook groups, you'll be able to work out when I wrote this presentation, because there's at least one photo from yesterday in here. So let's starting with Cotswolds. So this is the lock at John Robinson Lock or Westfield Lock, depending on how you know it. I was going to say is finished. We have actually got one more week to happen on this camp on this site yet, and it's actually now had, I think, five or 6 weeks this year. Quite a lot of work's happened on that. At this point, they're just rebuilding they've been taking down some of the derelict brickwork and are starting to rebuild it. Over on the Louth, this is actually this week's camp. This photo is the one that was taken yesterday. Again, another lock. This is Tickelpenny Lock, and they're starting to rebuild the lower wing walls. A couple of weeks ago now, this is the Lichfield and Hatherton at Darnford Moors Ecology Park, where they were doing some towpath work. And actually in this photo, you can see them installing some ducting under the towpath that will be used for sort of future power supplies to boats, etc. And then a camp that finished it was actually ended up being a slightly extended camp that finished last week on 𝗚𝗲cie𝗿𝗴𝗲, building a new access ramp. What you can't quite see in this photograph is that if I just give me the pointer, this is actually a set of steps, because we weren't able to quite get all of the work done to get the second leg of the ramp in, but we're currently working with the local society and the leaders from that camp to work out when we can go back and finish that job off properly. And then they're sort of the main ones that have happened this year. I think it's also worth probably looking at some of the other jobs we do, because one of the sort of the nature of the way our work programme works is we obviously don't end up with exactly the same work every year. We always get a bit of variety. We try and keep some variety in the programme as much as possible. So looking at some other ones that have happened, and you do get to play a bit of bingo in here and see how many times I feature in these photos. This is a big concrete block work wall that was built at Staveley on the Chesterfield Canal. We often do a lot of sort of quite big earthworks jobs and moving earthwork around, sort of digging channels, putting culverts in. So this is on the Hereford and Gloucester a couple of years ago. This one, a bit different. This was a slipway that was built at Ayleston Park on the Hereford and Gloucester. This was actually my first ever canal camp about 14 years ago now. This one, I must apologise, I can't actually remember where it is, but this is building a bywash culvert or rebuilding in stone, so concrete base and stone sets on top. And just occasionally we do things that are, again, different. So it's not always about the actual canal structure itself. So this is the lock cottages at Draycott, not lock cottages, just the cottages at Draycott, sorry. This is on the Derby and Sandyacre, and here they've been restoring these cottages to use as a cafe, a meeting room, and some of the properties are now let out as sort of standard homes. And this is actually a London work weekend where we went and helped out with doing some of that work. And similar, but on a different sort of scale, this is an old, I think it's the tunnel keeper's cottage on the Shrewsbury Newport. And then also during the sort of more winter months, we also do a certain amount of vegetation clearance and sort of, burning all the rubbish and basically clearing the channel so that we can come along and do works in the future. So we do quite a wide variety of things. As I said, every year we try and do a mixture of work. We try not to do too much of the same. We naturally do get cycles where we'll get 1 year I'll have quite a lot of brickwork, one year I'll have quite a lot of machine work, but we try and keep a balance. because we do have quite a wide skill set in WERG, but we have a lot of, there are people who specialise in sort of different things. So we try and make sure there's something for all of them. And also, I think it's key that we try to avoid having too much that's specialist every year, because the subset of our volunteers who can do sort of really technical work tends to be a bit smaller, and so we try and sort of not have too many really technical jobs, because we know we're quite reliant on a much smaller pool of people. I will say at this point, one job you will have noticed I haven't shown any photographs of is canal lining. We have done lining. We do occasionally do lining. It's not a task we enjoy or a task we particularly like to do. It's very, very difficult to get right, and it's very difficult to ensure continuity in lining when you've got a group of volunteers, and particularly when you've got sort of multiple weeks of camps in a row and you've got volunteers sort of changing over. So it's not a job we try to do too often. So if I move on next to sort of who does what, and as I say, I've split this between sort of what WERG does and what the host society does. So from a WERG point of view, what we're offering typically, obviously we will generally recruit the volunteers for that camp. We do all this sort of administration associated with that. That's supported by the team in head office, Jenny and Verena. We will source and give support to a site leadership team. That's normally a site leader and an assistant site leader, normally an experienced sort of WERG volunteers, but obviously we do also have new people coming through that are sort of learning to be leaders and assistants, and we support them in that. Now, sometimes if the work is slightly less technical, you might get a slightly less experienced leader, but we're always happy to talk about that and make sure that we try and match the skills of the leader to the skills of the camp. We generally will deal with all the site paperwork. There's a little bit of a restriction around that, because obviously, whilst we are coming onto a site and doing some work, obviously for a lot of the canal projects, we might be coming on to a site that already exists, a site that's already in process. And in that case, we will also sort of pay attention to what you've already got in place from a site paperwork point of view, particularly from a CDM perspective, so that we sort of fit in with that. But equally, when we run these camps, WERG does typically prefer to be the main contractor on that site at the time. So if you've got local volunteers that are coming in just to support us during that time, we do ask generally that they work under our control, so that we can ensure a consistency across all of our camps every year. We then also bring the WERG kit. That comes in 2 vans and a trailer. The 2 vans you'll have seen pictures of before, red vans, 9-seater crew vans, and the equipment trailer will then have basically a lot of the small hand tools, so the bricklaying equipment, concrete mixer, generator, rakes and shovels and saws and all of that sort of stuff. What the host society, so generally in this call, you lot, what you would be responsible for, you're responsible for all the permissions on the site, so things like planning consent, water abstraction licenses, ecology, etc. Ultimately, we are, in large, we're a contractor in this arrangement. So you're responsible for making sure that all the permissions are in place for us to do the work. And that's a perfect time to plug the fact that one of the upcoming webinars in this series will be a webinar more about permissions. I think I'm not quite sure we've agreed a date for it yet, but that's one that I will be doing along with a representative from Canal and River Trust. Site welfare. Now, so in our equipment, we bring a gazebo, we bring a 𝗚𝗏 for heating water, for cups of tea, etc. But generally things like toilets is the sort of main one. Sometimes there are site cabins, etc. But if there aren't site cabins, then we'll try and make sure we've got additional gazebos or whatever to just make sure that people can shelter out of the rain when they're trying to have their tea break and their lunch. The host society is then also responsible for all of the sort of larger plant equipment and materials. So things like excavators, dumpers, all the blocks and bricks and sand, etc. that's required. We can help advise what is required, and generally, particularly with plant, we really encourage local societies to talk to us and talk to the leaders about what equipment is needed, so that we get the right equipment and we can make sure we've got the right operators for that equipment. We do generally work on the principle of trying to get plants that we can operate ourselves, and I'll come a little bit onto driver authorization later on. And we have got people who can sort of also support with, you know, how much material you're actually going to need, how much work do we think we're going to do, and the like. Then probably the biggest and often the most complicated one for local societies to arrange is accommodation. I'm going to come on to accommodation in a moment. I've got, you know, a picture of a village hall to show you and just talk through some of the things that we have to consider for that. Then there's fuel, and in the case of fuel, I'm talking about the fuel for obviously all the plant and equipment. So again, the diggers and dumpers, whatever's required for the job, but also the local society pays for the fuel that goes into the work vans. You don't pay for volunteer fuel. You know, volunteers are responsible for their own expenses getting to the site, and volunteers pay for food, but work recharges the fuel for the vans to the local society. And then finally, and almost certainly most importantly, is the local organizer. And by this I mean that person, you know, you've all got work party organisers or committee members, etc., that will be involved in planning the camps and helping with that, and sort of making sure that those people are available in the run up to a camp so that we can finalise details, you know, ordering materials. They can quite often being on site regularly during the camp is helpful. You can have that conversation with a leader. Often some leaders want more support than others, but that role is really important, because I think it's you have to remember that for most of the volunteers and the leaders, they're not local. You know, a lot of them, they come from all over the country, in fact, indeed all over the world, and so it is that they're not going to know where the nearest builder's merchant is, where Tesco is, etc. I think I'm just looking at a few notes that I've made on this. I think the only other thing I'm just going to mention at this point, before I forget it, is of course the other thing that both of those groups do, WERG and the host society, is publicity. You know, a camp is often a big boost for a local society, and you will want to publicise it. So, you know, take photographs, etc. We do ask that you sort of moderate the photographs or sort of run them by us if there's any sort of concerns. Obviously, we always try to work safely, and we always indeed do work safely. But quite often photographs don't look like that. So it's always worth just checking that one. So just moving on to accommodation. Don't try and guess the village hall, because I think it is just a random Google photograph that I found of a village hall. It's not one I've taken, but it is the sort of thing that we tend to be looking for. We use a lot of different sort of accommodations. We use, it is primarily village halls. We use scout huts. Sometimes we've ended up in hostels and, you know, things like that. Ultimately, the basic requirement is that we've got somewhere that's dry and warm, that we can set beds up. We've got tables and chairs for eating in, and we've got toilets, and we've got a kitchen. There's not a huge amount more to it than that, really, but it is probably always surprising quite how much space it takes up. One of the things that we did during COVID and sort of as we were coming out of COVID and starting to restart the camps again, was we re-looked at our accommodation guidance and sort of reinforced the message around spacing of beds and just giving people that bit more room. And what that means is, whilst our sort of core offer is typically 18 volunteers, we've tended in the last couple of years to restrict that to 12 until we've looked at the accommodation and assessed whether the accommodation and the site can support more people. So when a leader comes on a site visit, they will want to see the accommodation. As I say, kitchen's important. Obviously, we need sufficient working space in the kitchen. You know, feeding 18 people for a week is not an easy feat. Generally, a camp will have a specific person who is the cook. It is by far the most stressful job of the week. I can attest to that from years of experience. And so, you know, a good kitchen is important. Generally, we're looking for obviously a decent sort of domestic cooker, a 4-ring hob, etc. You need the electric points for the 𝗚𝗏𝗏 and the toaster and things like that, and a sink with hot and cold running water. I have found in the past you do need to check things like hot and cold running water. I have turned up to an accommodation before where the tap wasn't actually connected, which did make life a little bit interesting on the first night. We do also, work does have a gas cooker that we can bring in if necessary. So if the cooker's a bit rubbish, or there isn't a cooker, which there aren't always, particularly in scout huts, then we do have that facility, but we need to arrange that well in advance because that doesn't come with the kit as standard. We're then also looking, as I say, toilet and washing facilities. So typically we'd look for 2 men, 2 ladies. Showers are very, very often are not in the hall. Obviously, if they can be in the hall, that's ideal. But equally, you know, 1 shower in a hall is not really enough. So if you've only got 1 shower, you've got no showers, then typically we would look to arrange it with either bring a sort of shower unit onto the village hall car park, or we would look for an arrangement with a local leisure centre or sports club, etc. But again, that's something that the local society is responsible for organising as part of the accommodation. And lastly, parking. Obviously, most of our volunteers will come by car. We will arrange train pickups and bus pickups for those who come by public transport, but you've potentially got 12 to 18 people. So generally people are coming on their own. So you'll have sort of 12 to 18 cars, you'll have 2 vans, you'll have the work trailer. So it quite quickly can fill a car park up. And I think the last thing to say on accommodation is that, of course, this is our home for that week. So it does need to be secure. In an ideal world, we do like sole use of the accommodation for the period that we're there. That can be a challenge for halls, and sometimes we will sort of consider moving out of the hall, you know, sort of clearing all the beds up a couple of times a week if needs be for, you know, other clubs coming in, etc. But we don't like to do it very often, and ideally we don't do it at all, because obviously often when those clubs are in, we can't be in the hall, the cook often can't be in the hall, you know, so it makes life difficult. So that's one to really consider, and making sure actually that when you're hiring a hall, that the people you're hiring it from do know that we are staying there for a week. We're not hiring it out for 7 days and going home in the evenings, etc. You know, we are actually sleeping in it. So that's accommodation. If you've got any questions on accommodation, definitely do drop them in the Q&A box, because there's you know, I'm well aware from experience it's not the easiest area to find. So moving on a little bit then, I just thought it'd be worth touching on what else can Work and IWA offer. As I say, the canal camp is the core product, but we do other stuff around that. So in terms of other actual practical activities, we do have the weekend groups, so that there's basically a number of regional groups. They're not directly controlled by Work, but they're sort of affiliated to Work. So Work Northwest, Work London Work, 𝗚𝗏𝗿𝗄, Newbury Working Party Group, they're all groups that do weekend digs, so they'll come for 2 or 3 or 4 days sometimes, and just provide that sort of more bespoke support. We also have our bonfire bash or reunion. That is, as the name might suggest, is the beginning of November, normally the first weekend of November, and that is typically a dig. A few years ago, that would have been 120, 140 people. It is a bit smaller nowadays. We're probably 80 to 100 people, but that's 2 days. Generally scrub bashing, so generally tree clearance and sort of burning, etc. But we have done reunions that are other events. So sometimes there'll be satellite sites doing towpaths, or sites doing a bit of brickwork if the weather's right, piling earth, various things can happen. But the core ideally is scrub bashing, because it's a lot easier to organise. And obviously, as you can imagine, for 80 people, that can be a challenge, as is definitely finding accommodation, because at 80 people, you're more likely looking at schools and leisure centres, etc., which have got big enough halls to host people. Outside of the sort of more practical on-site work, there's a lot of background sort of technical support that can be provided. So IWA has a panel of honorary engineers. They can provide sort of technical support around sometimes the design of what you're doing, or just sort of giving you advice on how to restore a specific structure or whatever. That role is really important, because I think it's worth stressing that when work comes on a site, as I say, we are a contractor essentially, so we build what we're told to build. Now, obviously, there's a lot of very experienced people, and we do know sort of roughly what we should be building, but we do, if there's more specialist areas that need designing properly, so if you've got to build a bridge, or you've got to build, or you're building a retaining wall, or things like that, that needs some design input. If you're doing concrete pours and you're doing shuttering, so you've got temporary works, etc., again, that all needs a level of design, and work itself isn't there to do that. So that is sort of something that the local society should be providing as part of their request for a camp. This is the details of what you're doing, this is how it's designed, etc. But the honorary engineers can support with that. We also then have a couple of other advisory panels that are useful. So there's the planning advisory panel that can talk to you about planning consent, and also away from the sort of practical restoration, can also support you with responding to planning applications that might be detrimental to the canal. We then have the heritage advisory panel, that sort of similar basis, but for the heritage features on a canal. There's then the wider technical support. Now, obviously, the technical support used to very much be mixed role, and at the moment, the IWA is still sort of working out exactly how that role is being replaced. Some of that will be through sites group, so it will be through me and some of my colleagues on sites group. Some of it will be through the honorary engineers, etc. But ultimately, if you're unsure about anything in that regard, you start by contacting head office, and then Jenny and Verena will probably direct you to me or somebody else in the sites group who can support in the first instance. We do also have some of our own plant and equipment, by which I mean sort of things that are bigger than what goes in the trailer. So we do have sort of an excavator, there's sort of pumps and sort of electrical equipment, etc. That is available. You do need to obviously request it well in advance, and to be honest, a lot of the time it is generally cheaper to hire it than it is to get us to bring it, because obviously, if you're over in Swansea and you want the excavator and it's currently on the 𝗚𝗏𝗿𝗄, a sort of 6-hour round trip for somebody to bring the excavator on a trailer and all the fuel associated with that, often it just doesn't end up being economic, and it's better to hire it. And obviously we can't make any guarantees it's available at any time anyway, because we do tend to quite often with that sort of equipment have sort of relatively long-term agreements with some of the societies whereby they've sort of got it on extended loan, etc. But if you've got if the specialist kit is needed for a camp, generally the work leaders will have an idea as well, but it's always worth just asking us, and we'll put you in touch with the sort of plant team who can advise on whether anything is available. We then also do quite a lot of training, which I'll come to again in a second. And there is a training grant that we also run that supports that, which will pay up to £750, I think, from memory, up to perhaps it's probably 75% of training. I can't remember the exact details. If anybody's interested in that, we can always look it up. And then there are a lot of restoration resources. These are not work specific. These are done by IWA, generally under the Restoration Hub banner. So the one on the screen there is the Practical Restoration Handbook. Many of you will probably be familiar with that anyway, because it was a document that was first produced about 20 years ago, but it's recently undergone quite a good refresh to bring it up to date, and so that's available on the website. And all of the work camps will have that with them when they come to site. We use that for guidance on how to do certain tasks, and within that there's also a whole load of toolbox talks, etc. And then lastly on this list is the driver authorization scheme. So as I said earlier, our general preference is that we like to try and hire equipment that we can self-drive. We run a driver authorization scheme in work where we basically train our various of our volunteers in driving excavators, dumpers. It covers our vans, dredgers. There's about 30 categories nowadays. There's a lot of different things within that. And within that scheme, we have both sort of operators and then instructors. So people who are authorised on behalf of the work board to instruct people in how to use this equipment. That scheme is available also to local societies. Many local societies will have their volunteers also trained under the same system. It falls within the IWA insurance, which is actually a point that I haven't got on this slide. And so sometimes during a canal camp, we will, if we know we need to try and arrange it, we'll try and arrange sort of additional instruction during the camp. And that also sort of feeds into our training weekends. I think the one thing that's probably important to note, though, about the driver authorization for complete clarity is it is not an industry qualification. So we do just occasionally have issues with sites. They're quite often local authority sites where they don't really understand and don't really like the driver authorization because it's not a sort of industry CITB certificate or whatever. So it's important to understand who owns the site and make sure that that's been addressed early if necessary. Because if we need equipment and we need people to drive it and we can't use our own drivers, then obviously that's an additional cost and an additional sort of issue that's got to be organised, making sure there's operators on site. The one thing, ultimately the only time I think I've known an operator actually sort of come with the machine was actually some work that was done on the Derby and San Diego a couple of years ago, lifting coping stones on, because the easiest way to do that ended up being using a little spider crane. And whilst we do have a cranes ticket on the driver authorization, it's really not something we do very much. So just wanted to sort of touch on training, because I've mentioned that earlier. Three pictures here of various bits of training we operate. On the top, you've got our training weekend. That's normally a 2-day event where we specifically are training people on site equipment of some form. So on that one, you can see different forms of dumpers. There's an excavator being trained, and also some of the sort of small plant and equipment. So things like concrete mixers and brick saws, surveying, how to put scaffolding up, etc. Bottom left, we do also occasionally do sort of more specialist training on specific skills. The most common ones we tend to end up doing are first aid courses and bricklaying, particularly heritage bricklaying, i.e. working with lime mortar, because that's always a little bit different. And then on the bottom right, that's our leaders training days. That's an event we run every year in May. And that is, we try and get as many of our leaders together as possible, both new and experienced. And we sort of, it's a chance for the work board to run through some of the things we've learned from the last year, sort of disseminate any key messages, share any sort of learning from between leaders, pass on knowledge from experienced leaders to new leaders and vice versa. And ultimately just constantly improve our practice. And all of those events are open to local societies as well as to WERG volunteers and leaders. It's that none of these things are, WERG is not a closed shop by any stretch. So just finally, and then we'll get on to some questions, the process for applications. So I think, and this is probably worth particularly emphasising, because in the last year we've had this has probably gone a little bit awry, and we're just trying to sort of get a bit more control back on this. So normally what the process will be for applying for a canal camp, we'll typically send invitations out. I will come to the timeline on this in a minute. So we'll send the invitations out, although we do invite applications, basically can be sent at any time. Complete the application form. That'll have details of sort of what work you're looking to do. Do you have the permissions? Do you have funding in place to deliver it? What's the accommodation? What equipment are you going to need? Things like that. You know, just to give us a general idea of what you're going to do. At the moment, I think that's either a paper form that's in the back of this document, Guide to Hosting a Canal Camp, which is on our website, but it is a little bit difficult to find, and we will make sure that this gets circulated to people. I think we're looking to just do a little bit of a refresh on it at the moment. But I think we are also developing this application form online. Whether it's going to be online for this year's applications, I'm not sure, but it will be possible to apply it online as well in the future. Once the application forms have all been submitted, then they get assessed by the WERG Sites Group. So we'll have a sort of first run through all the applications. You know, we've got a lot of experience. We can weed out anything that we just go, actually, this has misunderstood what we can do, or it's not going to be ready. Generally, you know, we very rarely just say no to people. We're very interested in it. We're not always able to say yes, but we don't like to say no. And by that, I mean that if we can't say yes, generally we will want to find a way to work with you to support you into a position where it is suitable, or to find what alternative offering we can give you that does actually, that gives you the support you need. Once we've done that application, generally we will want to try and do site visits where possible. There are sites we won't necessarily do site visits to if they're regular sites that we visit a lot, or we've got people who already know them. But particularly if they're new sites or new groups, etc., we will try and come and visit those sites to see what you're offering. This is all in advance of the actually sort of determining the schedule, because the WERG leaders who are appointed will always come and visit the site later on, but this is before we make a decision. Once we've done all of that, the sites group will then come up with basically a set of recommendations to the WERG board to say, okay, we've had these applications, these are ones that we think are worth WERG taking on, and these ones are ones that we want to support, and actually there are just a couple that really it's not worth us pursuing. And then the WERG board will sort of review all of that, and we'll put together the camp schedule for the following year. In terms of timescale, as I said, there's invitations we generally send out at the beginning of September. That is just because up until the end of August, we tend to be quite busy actually running this year's canal camps. So whilst technically applications are open basically all year, but particularly January to sort of October, it's the amount of sort of support, etc., we can give in, particularly in July, August, September, is July and August in particular, is a bit of a challenge. So we send out the invitations at the beginning of September to sort of go, right, come on, we're now thinking about next year. What do you want us to do? As I say, applications are open basically any time. And if they do come in early, with the new arrangement we've got with Sites Group, they'll generally come to me, and I can start providing some level of support, or can get others to provide some level of support in advance. So if you've got stuff that you are not sure on, or you're particularly new to it and you want more support, it is worth asking us early in the year. I mean, quite frankly, you can ask me now for 2025. I won't tell you now that you're going to get a camp in 2025, but I can certainly start working with you to make sure that when you come to apply next year, you've got the right information in that application, and it's as strong as possible. The assessments and site visits section, we tend to do that's September and October, and then we do the recommendations to the work board at the end of October, and the decisions are typically made at the bonfire bash at the beginning of November. And that's quite deliberate, because we obviously have a lot of our volunteers and most of the work board tend to be at that event, so it works quite nicely. And it means that generally we will put up a preliminary camp schedule on the evening of the bonfire bash, and then it's a good chance for us to start recruiting leaders, etc. Host societies will normally get informed just after the bonfire bash of what the provisional schedule is, and that is so that we can confirm the schedule. We can say to you, right, this is what we're offering you, are you still happy? And we get all of that locked in, and then the publicity machine can turn that into the camp's brochure for the following year, and sort of get it all ready, get it all set up on the website to open bookings, etc. This year's calendars has been a bit different to this, because with Mick leaving and a few other issues, we have been generally later confirming camps and particularly opening bookings, but we're definitely keen to get back to sort of a more traditional cycle for us from this year onwards. Also, just worth stressing, I realised that we talk about canal camps. They are generally in the summer, so they're generally sort of June to September, but we do camps at Easter. We do have a Christmas camp, and we do generally have camps at February and October half terms as well. And so you can apply just for a canal camp in general, or you can apply for a specific time of year. If you've got specific dates that you're interested in, particularly if that works for accommodation or for permissions or whatever, do let us know. Equally, if there are things like planning consent deadlines and you need us to get in and start a job within a certain time frame, let us know, have that conversation, and we can work it through. And I think that brings me to the end. I do realise that in all of my waffling around what else WERG offers, I did forget the WERG forestry team, which is, as the name suggests, is all our chainsaw experts, basically, who are all the experts at chopping large numbers of trees down and clearing. And they do have people who can do rope access and who can do sort of access by mobile working platforms, etc. So they're often good for sort of a lot of the bigger tree clearance jobs, and they obviously tend to work weekends and generally a week-long camp in October. So I think that brings me to the end of my slideshow. This picture, just as a final example of what we do, this is Bridge 70 on the 𝗚𝗏_𝗏 Canal, and this is this bridge, I think it's the last remaining bridge on the 𝗚𝗏_𝗏, and the local authority had sold it to the trust for £1, and they were trying to reinstate access over it properly because it was particularly bad. Had sort of it was all green and slippery and etc. And so we built in a set of what are actually equestrian compliant steps so that horses could get over it, etc. It wasn't possible to make it a ramp with the level difference, but we were able to put steps in. So that's going to finish. So if you've got any questions that you want to answer, at the moment I've only got one, so get in there now and start typing questions in the Q&A box. If there are, Verena, if there are any questions in the chat, can you drop them into the Q&A box, because I can't currently see the chat. Thank you. So we'll start with Lindsay's question. I am from Spike Island and Widnes Canal Restoration Group, which is not one I've ever heard of, so well done. We recently lost supply of water to the canal. We need works doing to the canal, including half a mile of reeded canal bed clearance, new lock gates, canal walls repairs. Is this something you can assist with? So the short answer is yes. That's all definitely stuff we can do, with slight exception of new lock gates. We don't fit lock gates. We don't build them, and we don't install them. That's too specialist, really. But certainly reeded canal bed clearance, we'd need to look at it exactly what you need doing, whether it's stuff that has to be done by hand, whether it can be a machine, etc. What sort of machinery we could get onto the path, but that's all definitely stuff that can be done. And canal wall repairs, yeah, I think that's very much bread and butter for us. You know, whether that's stone walling, brickwork, piling, etc., that's all stuff we can do. So very much drop us an email, or you know, if you want to have a chat about it before you sort of make any application, then drop us an email, and we can chat about that. And then Sam, you've asked about insurance. Just with a question mark, insurance. So I'm not quite sure what your question is, but I will go through what the insurance situation is. So ultimately, IWA runs the insurance scheme, basically, that covers Waterway Recovery Group and all of the, well, any of the local societies that also choose to sign up for that. As to the specifics of insurance for how canal camps work, it's probably worth noting that, you know, we're not a contractor in the sense of you've got any sort of recourse if the volunteers don't do a job properly. It's always something you should always consider in terms of what work you want work to do, because you know, if we built a massive retaining wall and it collapsed, it's not, the insurance situation can be a bit complicated in that, and if there are any sort of specific issues with that, we'd have to take them up sort of more directly with IWA and Neil Edwards in particular, just to sort of address the specifics of it. Because we'll say we're not sort of a contractor in the sense that we don't carry sort of all works insurance and things like that. We obviously carry, you know, we carry public indemnity and employee indemnity and all that sort of stuff, but it's not quite the same as a contractor, so it is something you have to consider. Has the bonfire bash been decided for this year? No, it has not. We have not currently got a site. If we are looking, if any of you have got sites, we would be very interested to hear from you. We have had a couple that we've been looking at that haven't currently come to anything. But so if anybody has got sites, we would be interested. It is something we obviously will need to try and arrange reasonably quickly. If it's scrub bashing, it's not too bad, but anything other than scrub bashing, it takes a little while. So no, at the moment we don't have a bonfire bash. Oh, Sam's come back on the public liability and health and safety. So yeah, I think I've probably answered that. Ultimately, public liability, yes, we carry. Health and safety, I get, so yeah, the volunteers are obviously insured for the work they do, as are the people, as are the public in that area, etc. What's not necessarily is the works liability, is the one that's sort of can be a bit of a grey area. At the I was going to say at the moment that's it. I should keep scrolling down. So, past canal camps on the Lancaster Canal, the northern reaches near Kendal have struggled with getting sufficient numbers of volunteers travelling up north. This was back in 2014. No plans as yet, as next section to work on is still in the early stages of channel work. Has Wyrg Northwest back in numbers help on maybe a weekend work party. So yes, I mean, ultimately this does go to an interesting point in that we do sometimes struggle to get sufficient number of volunteers for some of our more far-flung camps. We obviously do work all over the country. I've certainly done camps on the Lancaster. I've done camps on the Swansea and done camps on the Stover. So I've been to a reasonable spread of the country, but we do struggle to get people, probably particularly to go up north and particularly to go right out west in Wales. So just something to be aware of. We do try and make sure with the work that we're doing on that's not particularly reliant on a sort of a full 18 people. In terms of Work Northwest is struggling a little bit for numbers at the moment. You would have to discuss directly with them, but I'm happy, obviously, to put you in touch anyway. So yeah, they do weekend work parties, but at the moment, Work Northwest is struggling to get sort of, again, sufficient numbers for a weekend. And particularly Lancaster is a long way for quite a lot of Work Northwest as well. So we just have to take that one as it comes. Sam's trying to identify the location of the bywash. You think it's in Wales? I've got a feeling it is in Wales. You're right, Sam, but it was in a collection of Facebook photographs, and I've forgotten exactly where it was. So thank you for identifying that for me. I think I'm probably going to, unless there's any more questions come in, one thing I'm just going to talk about briefly. So I obviously talked about that core product of 18 people for a week on a site. But I think it is important to stress that 18 people can do a lot of work. And one of the things we will look for in an application is how much work is involved, etc. And it's not uncommon that you'll underestimate how much work will get done by 18 people. So we will pay attention to how much work there is to do and whether there is any sort of backup work. But I think it's also worth highlighting that in the last few years, we've recognised that the number of sites that are actually able to host 18 people is a bit more limited than it used to be. And so we're quite open to considering other smaller sites, if they just need half a dozen people for a week or a long weekend and things. We're trying to get more flexible in what we offer. So it is a case of just come and talk to us. And on a similar vein, I would say the other thing that's worth getting over in an application or in discussions with us is, why is the camp important to you? Why is this work important to you? Because it isn't always obvious to us. And I know that might seem an odd thing to say, but sometimes as a local society, you've got work to do that might not necessarily look like the most meaningful work or the work that's the best sequence for how to restore the canal. But you've obviously got specific areas that you can access, or you've got specific people you're trying to impress, or a specific community you're doing work in, or whatever. So do explain to us, and even if you're saying, look, we actually want to do this work, we know that in 10 years' time we're going to want to replace this work with something else, but we just want to get something started in this community, and so it's really, really worth it to us. Then do tell us that, because otherwise we can be a bit guilty sometimes of looking at the camps and going, well, that's the most worthwhile, that's the most worthwhile. Not in terms of judging restorations. We're never going to get into judging which society is, which canal project is more worthwhile than any other. They are all equally valid projects. But sometimes if the messaging behind what you want to get out of a canal isn't, out of a camp isn't particularly clear, then we might sort of overlook it. So it's always worth stressing that. So, Wyn, how do we contact you? What is your email address? Yes, not on the slides, is it? So my email address is, I'll find a way of typing it in. I'll put it into the chat. You can also email head office, and they will route it to me. But I've put my email address in the chat. Can I tell you a bit more about the planning advisory stuff that WRG provide? In short, probably not, because I don't really know. I'm not the expert in that. But if you are interested in that, we can get somebody to contact you and discuss it directly. I'm not an expert in that, unfortunately. So I think that is all of the questions. I suppose I'll stop sharing this picture. I think that is all the questions, and oh no, not quite all the questions. One more minute then. Sam's got one more question about permissions. It's a good job you asked some questions, Sam, otherwise nobody else, otherwise we'd have had far fewer. So more info about permissions. More info about permissions. The best thing I can say is come to the webinar in October, because we will talk much more in detail about that. I think WRG will typically look at certain key permissions, but it is ultimately the host society responsibility to arrange them. The key ones that we will look at generally are access. Have we got the right to access the site? You know, we're well aware that most host societies don't own the sites that they are restoring, so we want proof that you've got right of access. So generally that will be some form of working license, or or it will be land that you own, or just something that we can see, proof of letter from the landowner or whatever, something to show that you've got the right of access. That's really key. Things like planning consent obviously matter. I know there's always a debate about whether restoration requires planning and all of that side of things. I'm not going to get into that now. We'll get into that probably a bit more in the consents webinar in October. But if it requires planning consent, has it got planning consent? What are the conditions on that? What restrictions are there in terms of working hours, ways of working, materials, etc.? I think also any sort of environmental consents. So if you're working in a river, or you're working, or you've got sort of sensitive ecology, water voles, all of that sort of stuff, has that all been dealt with? So that's really key. And there's probably, I mean, there are an awful lot more, but I think that those are sort of the key ones really that we really pay attention to. I say access, ecology, environment, and planning, probably the key ones. October might be too late. Well, I suggest then you drop me a separate email on that one, Sam, and we'll do our best. But all I will say is, if you don't have consents, do also have quite a significant time frame to deal with. So. Right, I think therefore that is it. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We have recorded this, so if you wish to sit through it all again, you're very welcome. The recording will be somewhere in the future. I'm sure Verena will advise us in due course. And there will also be a chance to resit this whole experience in person in September, when we'll be rerunning it, and I will make a note of some of the questions and try and get some better answers for then. If anybody wants to rejoin, or you've got any of your other colleagues in societies that want to join as well, then let them know, and we will and I'll welcome them then. And if they've got any questions that they want to send in advance, then obviously please do so. I think we'll circulate the links to some of the documents that I've shown, so the guidance notes and the Host a Canal Camp document, and obviously we will be emailing you all in a few weeks' time to say that applications are open. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much, and good evening.